Hey guys, it's Alex West, the host of the And One podcast, just letting you know you can subscribe on YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes to the podcast to make sure you're getting the most up-to-date information. You can follow us at And One Analytics on Twitter. You can follow me personally at Alex West NBA. Today I'm joined by Levi Pitts of the 94 Feet Report, and we discuss the oft-ignored Toronto Raptors, why they never play on national TV, the success and change of Dwane Casey, as well as the best point guard you've never heard of, Fred VanVleet. So Brent, take us away. So I want to welcome my guest to the podcast today, Levi Pitts, writer for 94 Feet Report. How are you, Levi?
I'm doing good, Alex. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Maybe I should have said Levi Pitts Toronto Raptors beat writer for 94 Feet Report. Would that be more accurate?
I think that's pretty accurate. I try to get my boys on the page, front page of the 94 Feet Report every once in a while.
So that's a good place to start, I think. Let's start taking it apart. You're a big Raptors fan, have been a big Raptors fan for a while now. And this is a team that possibly hasn't received all the media coverage for whatever reason. And I think there are a myriad of reasons, but this is a team that has not received a lot of coverage, and they are the best team in the Eastern Conference. And when you look at the numbers, when you start to dissect everything, you see a team that's pretty darn good. And of course, I closed the tab. Here they are. They're 49-17. They have won their last 8. They're 17-2. Oh, 16-2 since January 28th. This is a team that has played tremendously, tremendously well in the second half of the season. So let's just kind of open the floor and talk Raptors for a minute. Give me your early take on the team.
Well, in the very beginning of the season, I think it was 10 games in, I wrote an article for 94 Feet Report, just kind of outlining a lot of the changes from this Raptors team compared to the past 3 years. And they had a very promising start, not an amazing start. I think they started about, 9-6 or something, or 9-5. And while we weren't blowing things out of the water like Boston or Cleveland was very early on, we were really showing a lot of signs that we could make a run later in the season once the rest of the East kind of went back to the mean, and that seems to be exactly what happened. Is as soon as Boston and Cleveland and Indiana and all them started kind of progressing back to where they should be, we ended up just taking that first seed, no problem, and now we're 3.5 games ahead of Boston. And I think that the early signs that we saw in the very beginning of the season really played out in the rest of the season. We have a team that's passing a lot more, a team that's really focusing a lot more on our youth and how important those guys are to each and every night, and how important people even like CJ Miles and Fred VanVleet can be in a team that's doing so well. But along with that, our stars have been playing great. I mean, you look at DeMar DeRozan, he's averaging 24, 4, and 6, and he's, playing some of the best basketball of his career. He's not scoring like he was, but he's more efficient from 3 than he's ever been, and he's passing a lot more, shooting. I think this is his it's his career high in assists per game, and it just a lot of what the Raptors are doing right now are really promising and really feel very helpful and different from the last few years. And it shows in their record. It shows in the numbers. It's pretty hard to argue with it.
And I think it's pretty easy to draw the line back to Dwane Casey, the head coach for the Raptors. This is a guy who was sort of set in his ways last year, and pundits, fans have often said that he's not adaptable, and there was even talk late last season after the playoff exit that maybe Dwane Casey was on the hot seat. But it certainly seems like he's changed gears and embraced the new era of the NBA, because you see in the games when you start to watch, and I particularly focused in on 2 games as I was prepping to do this. I focused in on the Houston game, and then I watched the Washington game, both from just the past couple of weeks. And what you saw in those games in particular, and the reason I chose those games is because Washington, obviously a playoff team that in the Eastern Conference that hasn't necessarily put it all together. and then Houston being the best team in the NBA. And what I saw from Toronto was a team that had changed its mentality more than anything else. And Dwane Casey has obviously been the focal point of that. And I think that's why he's a runaway favorite for Coach of the Year, because it's not very often when you see a coach who sort of embraces a change. And a lot of coaches, even as we get into this information era, as we start to understand advanced statistics and the revolution that's taken place over the past 15 years, there are still a lot of old school guys heading up teams, and Dwane Casey, I think, falls into that category. But to see him embrace this change and to really instill it in his guys is a pretty amazing thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, first off, I think Dwane Casey is far and away the Coach of the Year this year. Especially if the Raptors can lock up the first seed or get 60 wins. Either one really cements his ability to coach, essentially. And even though I came on this exact podcast about a year ago, and
probably close to that,
told you that Dwane Casey should be fired immediately, I think that Masai Ujiri had faith in him, and I think that he really took a chance on a coach that kind of proved himself to be a bad coach, and kind of just had hope and had faith in him, and it worked out. I mean, you look at how incredible they've been this season. I mean, they're top 5 in both defense and offense, the only team that's done that this year, first off. But they've also just changed so much, like, first off, they're shooting 33 threes a game, which is about 8 up from last year, along with the fact that they're passing way more. And like I said, their assist numbers are up, and it's really incredible to watch this team, because if you watch this team at all last year, you're looking at a slow isolation offense that resulted in a lot of things like, Jonas Valanciunas bricking some layup because they went to him in the post, and Jonas Valanciunas is kind of not great in the post, or whatever they're doing, or they're putting DeMar DeRozan on just 4 guys, 4 defenders. They're trying to get him through, and it just didn't work. Like, the past 3 seasons have been a lot of pass to DeMar or pass to Lowry and let them do their thing, but this year they've really gotten everybody involved. And like I said, it's shown in DeMar's stats with his assist numbers up, but it's also shown in a lot of the role players' stats being close to, if not double digits. I mean, CJ Miles is averaging 10 a game, along with Jakob Poeltl and Pascal Siakam, both averaging 7 points a game. They were both players that barely averaged 5 points a game last season, and were able to bump that up just because they're getting the ball more. And I think it's really, really impressive to see what Casey has done with this team, considering how much of a hole he dug him into last season.
Yeah, and Lee Jenkins, Lee Jenkins, famous Sports Illustrated writer, just did a piece about Dwane Casey and how he's changed, and there's a quote in it that's so great. And it says, "It's not so much call plays for Kyle, call plays for DeMar. It's more random pick and rolls, move the ball side to side, and read and react. He used to bench Valanciunas for threes, and now he encourages the 7-footer to let it fly." And you see exactly like you outlined, it's not about alternating possessions between Lowry and DeRozan. It's about movement first and foremost, and getting that weak side action, getting that as we've come to understand. And I guess, in some sense, we've always known this, but now there's numbers that bear this out. These weak side actions are really, really profitable for teams, setting off-ball screens or pin downs and running guys off of it. And we've seen, obviously, the Warriors sort of leading the league in those kinds of things, and setting Klay Thompson up for great shots. But now to see this transfer into a team that has 2 dominant ball handlers, and to see them be able to, in the game that I watched, I saw him run a lot of weak side action with DeRozan having the ball, and then what essentially turned Kyle Lowry into a curl shooter. So, he would, Valanciunas would set it up screen, Lowry would roll off of it, catch the ball, and sort of just be uncontested, particularly if Valanciunas' man couldn't come over the top to contest that. And to see those kinds of things, it definitely highlights a change in demeanor. It definitely highlights a change in strategy. And I think that's the really big thing for this team is just how differently they go about attacking teams on offense. Now, when you look at those numbers, and you talked about last year, they were 22nd in the league in three-pointers attempted. They were 21st in three-pointer makes. This season, they're third in attempts and seventh in makes. Now, if that's not embracing the future and the points per possession value of the three-point shot, I don't know what is. This is a team that very clearly has changed their tune. But beyond Dwane Casey, I suppose nothing is beyond Dwane Casey since he makes all the head calls. There is another part of this team that has just been absolutely fantastic, and that's been the bench unit.
Oh, yeah.
And the number that I wanted to throw out there, and then I'll let you have the field, is C.J. Miles, Jakob Poeltl, Pascal Siakam, Fred VanVleet, and DeLon Wright, which is an entirely a bench lineup, has a net rating of 24.9. Now, that's the best net rating in the league for lineups that have played more than 100 minutes. So let's talk about the bench unit for the Toronto Raptors and what it's meant this season, particularly in games in the past couple of weeks.
Well, the bench unit has been kind of the glue that's held everything together. I mean, you look at DeMar and Lowry and Ibaka, and you see this good core of scorers, good defense on everybody, but then you kind of bleed into this bench unit, and you realize that players like Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet, C.J. Miles, Jakob Poeltl, they have been playing fantastically, and they have been essentially making up for any mistakes the starters might end up making. And I think that's extremely valuable in a system, especially a system that's involving the ball more and moving it around and making sure that everybody's involved. Once you get good bench players out there, they thrive in a system that's moving the ball, and they thrive in a system that's trying to get them shots. And I think that has been – the bench unit has been extremely important both from the standpoint of just having a good bench in general, but also from a standpoint of having a good bench helps the system that we've instilled in our guys at this point in the season.
Yeah, and obviously the focal point, or at least for me, the focal point for this is Fred VanVleet. Second-year man out of Wichita State, a player who won the Missouri Valley Conference Player of the Year twice. He was a huge part of these big runs that Wichita State has had in the NCAA tournament in the past couple of years. And coming into the league, 2 seasons ago, there was a lot of talk that he was probably too slow. Even though he'd been an impact player, he was probably too short, too slow. And I think a lot of that has been proven to be wrong at this point because Fred VanVleet has been one of the best bench players in the league. And when you look at his numbers this year, they're pretty spectacular. I have my doubts about using per 36. A lot of people will say, "Oh, look at his per 36s." Well, he's a bench player, so his per 36s aren't that great of an indicator. But when you look at his actual raw numbers, here's a guy who's averaging 8.2 points, 3.1 assists, 2.5 rebounds in 19 minutes a game, and he more than anything that in his numbers and his box score. When he comes in the game, you see that he belongs. He has injected himself into this lineup. He, in fact, gone so far as to be playing in crunch time minutes for the Raptors. He's a player.
He's been good in those crunch time minutes.
He's been really good in those crunch time minutes. He makes the game winner a couple of weeks ago against Detroit. And so here's a guy who sort of came out of nowhere, and it speaks to Masai Ujiri being able to find talent on the scrap heap. A 4-year player who's a little bit too short, a little bit too slow, and all of a sudden he's playing huge minutes for this playoff team.
Mm-hmm. I've been watching Fred VanVleet. Fred VanVleet. I've been watching him a lot recently, and just kind of after his game winner in Detroit, I kind of looked back and tried to look at his stats and look at a lot of things he's been doing because he kind of has gone under the radar as one of the best bench players in the league because no one really talks about him, and I think that's another situation where not a lot of people talk about the Raptors in general. But
hold on, just putting a pin in the Fred VanVleet thing. There is a part to this that is sort of makes sense when you think about it. That according to Zach Lowe, he said this on a podcast sometime back, and his in-laws live in Toronto, so he has a pretty good connection with the Raptors organization. He goes there, he talks to people a lot. He said that it is very, very expensive because of the taxes in Canadian television to broadcast games from Canada into the United States. And as a result, TNT, ESPN, NBA TV would rather broadcast any game that they can get a hold of in the United States because it's more profitable. And so to speak to your point there, I think that that's what you're dealing with is a situation where nobody sees the Raptors because it's very hard to put them on TV. So anyway, go ahead.
You basically run into this situation where unless they're playing a big name team in their city, you're not really going to be able to watch them. And you see it in the most recent Houston-Toronto game that very well should have been on national TV, but just you can't really convince anybody to do that because it is very expensive to fly up to Toronto. It's expensive to do all that filming there. And like you said, they have those weird taxes and stuff. And so I definitely get the point. It's definitely a lot more difficult to watch Raptors games in general, but luckily I've been able to do it somehow. But going back to Fred VanVleet, he's such an interesting player because you look at him and even just from a straight stat standpoint, you just go like, man, this guy's good. Like he's really good. And he kind of reminds me of Kyle Lowry in a lot of ways where he's effective from three, but that's not his whole game. And he's able to show up in big spots like in Detroit, and he's able to really belong on that team. And he really feels like somebody that everybody on that team respects, despite him just being an 8 points a game bench player. But you see it in the last game where DeMar DeRozan, a player who in that Detroit game also had a very clutch moment where he ran into the lane and dunked it to force an overtime. He himself in the last minutes of that overtime ran down the lane and threw it to Fred VanVleet because he trusted him enough to take that shot. He trusted Fred over him just because Fred was open. And when you see plays like that and you see the way they reacted to him making that shot, it just gives you this feeling that he really does gel with the rest of the team. And I think that that's something that's way more important than people give credit for, because you can look at his stats and say, he's good, but he's not great. And then, you can kind of make that argument through stats and through the fact that he's a bench player. But when you watch him on the court, there's so much more that goes into it than just his stats and just his stat line.
Yeah, if you sort of take apart the resume of Fred VanVleet, you find these really interesting nuggets. He was at Wichita State for 4 years, and in those 4 years, they made the Final Four and the Sweet 16 twice. So this is a player, and he was probably the best player on that team, And so this is a player who has put himself in these big situations before, and on teams that probably weren't as talented. They lost to Louisville. He was a freshman that year, but playing against teams like Miami, Notre Dame, Kansas. They beat Kansas his junior year in the tournament. They beat Arizona his senior year in the tournament. These blue blood programs. Fred VanVleet is a player who has consistently performed on this high level, and I think it brings up this really interesting question that we don't necessarily have to unfold here, but it is interesting nonetheless that as the league gets younger, there's a tendency in the early part of the draft, and I think fairly because of youth, to draft freshmen. But we see players like Taurean Prince, we see players like Fred VanVleet who come in and are able to make an early impact in their career because they do have 4 years of college experience, or in some cases 3 years. And I think Fred VanVleet is the perfect example of a guy who got everything out of 4 years in college. And there are players, Devontae Graham at Kansas this year, maybe Joel Berry, just sort of depending on where he ends up, but Javon Carter at West Virginia. There are players, particularly at the point guard position, who will come in and be able to make an impact. And I think that's what Fred VanVleet is.
Yeah, I think that him staying 4 years in college is a big part of why people were able to pretty properly evaluate him and realize that he's a good player and that he can add a lot of value to the team. And he's currently sitting at 8th in minutes on the Raptors right now. And because of his play when he was in college and the fact that he was able to show up on those very good, very important teams in very important scenarios, really makes his playoff experience once we get into the playoffs is very important. I mean,
agree.
You look at Delon Wright, who's currently right above him at 20.4 minutes per game compared to 19.5. And while Delon Wright's been good and he's been about on par with VanVleet in the regular season, I think it's pretty unlikely that he gets more minutes than him in the playoffs, just considering what we've seen from him in college and the fact that we know that he's going to step up in those big moments and we know that he's important. I mean, just the other night with that clutch shot, I think that really cemented him as somebody that knows what to do and knows where to be. And I think that once we get into the playoffs, he'll definitely make much more of an impact than he feels like he's making now, even though he is making a great impact.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, he is 8th in minutes, but he's 4th in clutch minutes. So he's playing in these big spots for the Toronto Raptors. Our own Paul Headley for the 94 Feet Report wrote a great article that's on the front page today. If you want to check that out, you should. That's a plug for Paul. That's a plug for the 94 Feet Report. Do whatever you want with that. But this is a player who consistently has proven himself to belonging despite just being a second-year man. Now, that's enough for Fred VanVleet. We've talked about him a lot. I told you I had Fred VanVleet things that I wanted to say, and we've said them. Let's change gears and talk about something. There are two things that I really want to get into before we wrap this bad boy up, and that is the potential Toronto-Cleveland matchup, and then that is also where the Raptors might play when it comes in terms of network. But let's talk about the Cleveland Cavaliers first. Now, the Raptors have only played Cleveland once. It was January 11th. They won 133-99. Absolute blowout. However, the Raptors have 2 games left against the Cavaliers on March 21st and on April 3rd. Levi, what can we learn from these games, if anything? Is this something that we can possibly start to take away from as the playoffs come? Because potentially, depending on how you feel about the Celtics, depending on how you feel about maybe the Sixers, I don't know what your Eastern Conference layout is, but potentially what you're looking at is a Raptors-Cavaliers matchup in the Eastern Conference Finals. So it begs the question, with 2 games to go and only 1 game on the record, what can we learn by watching these 2 teams in the regular season?
Alex, I'm not even positive there's much to learn from these next 2 games in the regular season, and you can sum that up in one word, and that's LeBron. I mean, he'll play amazing in the regular season like he always does, and he'll have some fancy passes, he'll do some amazing stuff, but you're just never going to see playoff LeBron in the regular season, and that's going to be the thing that defeats the Raptors. If LeBron shows up and plays the best basketball of his career, then it's pretty hard to beat him. But if he shows up and and we're able to, keep him from really getting where he needs to go, and we keep him from beating us, I think that we have a much better chance. So while I do think that we can learn some from the next 2 games, I'm not positive it's really going to help out trying to figure out how that matchup's going to go, especially if we don't see playoff LeBron in those games, which is pretty unlikely in my opinion.
Yeah, one of the things when I look at the roster for the Raptors is I don't see a lot. I hate saying this because it always has a negative connotation, but I don't see a lot of LeBron stoppers. And the one name that I can look at on the roster is rookie OG Anunoby, who has been out with a sprained ankle for the past couple of games. Do you feel like you have to depend pretty heavily on Anunoby in his rookie year? Because Stanley Johnson did a pretty decent job a couple of years ago in his rookie year. Obviously, the Pistons were a different situation and they got swept out of the playoffs. But you understand that putting a rookie on LeBron James is a bad idea because he's good at basketball. Who else on this roster besides Anunoby can contribute in the slowing down, which is not to say the stopping of LeBron, because that doesn't happen. Who's going to slow him down?
I'm not positive that there is somebody that's going to be slowing down LeBron, and that's a big issue with the team right now. Is while OG Anunoby is a fantastic defender, and I will defend him to my grave because he's incredible, like you said, you can't really rely on a rookie to guard one of the greatest basketball players of all time. It's too hard to ask, and we know that he's still playing out of his mind, and we know that he still has the potential to just step up and be incredible. And I think there are a few contenders for some good defense on him. I think Jakob Poeltl, while he is a while he is a center and he is about 7 feet tall, I still think that he has a lot of surprising quickness in him and can defend a lot better than people think, especially defending somebody like LeBron James. I'm sure he can defend him a lot better than people think, but at the same time, he's also a second-year player. You don't really know what you're getting with him, and I think that's currently probably the biggest problem we have at this point is just when you look at the roster, you don't really see anybody that can put much pressure on LeBron, and we just got to hope that DeMar and Lowry can show up enough so that he doesn't matter as much.
Not only do you not see anybody who can put pressure on LeBron, when you start to take apart this roster, you see that the Raptors really fall into two camps. You have the DeMar DeRozan, Kyle Lowry, Norm Powell, DeLon Wright, CJ Miles group, which is 6'5", 6'4", guards, a little bit on the smaller side, put Fred VanVleet in that group. And then on the other side, you have the Giannis Valanciunas, Serge Ibaka, Jakob Poeltl, Pascal Siakam group, who is basically strictly bigs. And when you look at all those names, that's the rotation. That's the playoff rotation. And in that group, besides OG Anunoby, nobody really falls into that 6'8" with the ability to defend the perimeters skill set. And to me, that's a really big problem for this team because we've seen what LeBron can do against teams that do have a quote-unquote, again, I hate saying this, LeBron stopper. Obviously, Damari Carroll didn't work out, and you can name 100 names of teams players that teams have tried to throw at LeBron unsuccessfully. It was Tayshaun Prince early in his career. It was Paul Pierce for a while, then Damari Carroll, then name after name after name, and LeBron consistently overcomes these things. But the Raptors don't really have that guy, and to me, that's a really big concern. What do you think you can see in these next two games that can sort of assuage the ability that LeBron has to impact the game? Do you think that you can just let LeBron get his, or do you think that there's a thing that they're going to try out that will encourage you for the playoffs?
Well, first off, Damari Carroll not working out is a pretty big understatement for how bad he was. But moving on from that, I think that the key to stopping the Cavs with this roster is not going to be looking for somebody on this team to try to beat LeBron, but it's going to be establishing a very similar strategy that a lot of teams used to do back when LeBron was on the Cavs with no help, which is essentially let LeBron do what he's got to do and try to stop everyone else. Because if you look at our roster, it lines up pretty well with the rest of Cleveland's roster. I mean, I'm not sure anybody on that team is better than DeMar DeRozan other than LeBron, and most of them aren't as good as Kyle Lowry. And while excuse me, Alex. And while I think that Kevin Love could certainly help them out, I'm not sure that Valanciunas and Jakob Poeltl can't stop him. I think that we could easily see a situation where they let LeBron do what he's got to do and just try to attack everybody else. Very physical, very adamant about good defense and staying on top of everything, and just hope that LeBron can't go off for 50 every game.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that is the way to go about it. I mean, maybe I think it's fair to say that there is no good way to go about this. Let's just briefly talk about the other matchup that could potentially rear its head in the conference finals, and that's the Boston Celtics. Now, the Celtics beat the Raptors on November 12th. The Raptors handily beat the Celtics 111-91 on February 6th. There are still 2 games to go, so Toronto has a lot of big games on the schedule left in the regular season. And maybe the April 4th matchup is probably both teams resting if the seedings have been decided. But is there anything you look to learn for these matchups with the Celtics? Because this is another group that can probably trouble you a little bit with personnel, with players like Jaylen Brown, with even Shemi Ojeleye, Jason Tatum, a lot of players in that wing area who can sort of trouble the Raptors a little bit. Is there anything you hope to learn in these last 2 matchups against the Celtics?
I think the one thing that I'm hoping to learn is to try to see how our youth is matching up against Boston's youth, because we're both teams that rely very heavily on our young guys. And you look at some of our best players are OG Anunoby, Delon Wright, Fred VanVleet. And then you look at Boston, you're looking at Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, Terry Rozier. You're looking at these young guys and how well they've been playing and how they've been able to carry that team to such a good record. And I think that's probably the big thing to look for in these next two games is how those guys are going to match up against each other. Because while someone like LeBron kind of coasts in the regular season, you see a lot of rookies and second-year players really trying their best in the regular season. And in those matchups, we'll definitely see a very fully formed version of how both of those, or how our young players' games are going to match up against each other. But definitely the X factor in Boston once again becomes one player, which is, Kyrie Irving's a really good basketball player.
As it turns out.
He's proven multiple times in the past that he can show up on the biggest stages, and I think that's really where I get a little nervous. Is I look at our players like DeMar DeRozan and Kyle Lowry, and I'm kind of shaken about the fact that they haven't had the best postseasons, and that's just kind of a fact at this point. But you look at Kyrie Irving, and he's had nothing but great postseasons, and it's pretty hard to think that we can match up against them if you're going off just the last few years. But I kind of have to hold out hope that DeMar and Lowry can pull it out and try to beat the Celtics.
Yeah, when you look at these two rosters and you sort of pair them up against each other, one thing jumps out to me that the Celtics sort of have a mark for all of the best players that the Raptors have. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will work out, but you have a tremendous, probably one of the best defenders in the league in Marcus Smart, and I will continue to say that until I die. Matching up with Kyle Lowry, and then you have a pretty capable defender in Jaylen Brown matching up with DeMar DeRozan, as well as Al Horford, who has statistically been one of the best rim protecting centers. This is going to be a much different matchup, and to me, this is the preferable matchup for the Eastern Conference Finals, not just as a Celtics fan, but as a basketball fan. There's a lot of chess to be played in this matchup, and hopefully we'll get to talk about it a little bit more as we get into the playoffs. But there's one more thing I wanted to touch on before I let you go, and that is right now the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, the Toronto Raptors, 49-17. The number 8 seed is the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, Levi, I hate to be this guy, but is this the series that's going to be on NBA TV?
Sorry, Alex, you cut out there for a minute. What was that last few parts?
Is this the series? Is the Raptors and the Bucks the series that's going to be on NBA TV during the first round? Because, they always get that one NBA TV series.
Well, here's the thing. Let's go back to last year's playoffs where it was the same thing. It was the Bucks versus Raptors in the first round. And if y'all watched that series, I don't know if any of the listeners did or if you did, Alex, but I watched that series, and it was honestly some of the best basketball I've seen in a while. It was Giannis, who's such a transcendent and incredible player and is so fun to watch, versus DeMar, who is another one of those just transcendent players and incredible to watch. And you were watching Giannis trying to keep up with everybody and doing a pretty damn good job at it too. I mean, that series went to 6 when it arguably should have gone to, 3, or it should have gone to 4 or 5.
Raptors in 3?
Raptors in 3, dude. That's what I'm saying. But I think that series is going to be a lot better than people think it is. And I think that could easily end up on NBA TV and still be incredibly entertaining.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think ending up on NBA TV is in any way an indictment of the quality of play. What I do think is that the Raptors just sort of tend to, even if you go back a couple of years, the Washington-Toronto series was on NBA TV last year, the Milwaukee series. Toronto, for whatever reason, probably, as we discussed earlier in the podcast, the tax situation, ends up on NBA TV a lot. Hopefully, we'll get to see a few more games, and I know that I'm very excited to watch Giannis in the playoffs, if this indeed even is the matchup. I mean, the Bucks are a half game behind the Heat, and they're 1 game behind the Sixers, so there's a lot of jockeying for position, because I don't think in any imaginable capacity that ESPN or TNT will let them put the 76ers on NBA TV. I think there'll be a fight for that.
I think it's certainly unfortunate that we're looking at the first round of the 1 seed facing the 8 seed on not on national TV.
Yep.
That's going to be pretty bumming, honestly. But I guess that's just the woes of Canada at this point.
I guess so. So the last thing, and then I'll let you go. Last thing about this whole Raptors situation is I'm not sure I believe in the Raptors. I'm just not. And, this is something I've sort of talked about with other people. I've touched on it. I'm not sure until LeBron is dethroned in the Eastern Conference that I believe that the Celtics, the Raptors, the Sixers, whoever you want to say, can win the Eastern Conference until it's done. How do you as a Raptors fan feel about that? The idea that LeBron is only dead when you see him dead?
Well, first off, even if I put my Raptors bias aside, which is a very heavy bias, by the way, even if I set that aside for just a minute, I look at this team and I still feel like this team has a big chance at making at least the conference finals and possibly even the finals, as long as it matches up well. But I look at this team and I understand the reasoning behind not believing in them, and I understand why so many people don't at this point, because really all we have to go off of is the last 3 years of playoff disappointment and terrible ISO basketball. But I think for everyone that's watched this team this year, and I know that not a lot of people have, but a good amount have, I think for the people that have watched this team, you're seeing a completely different team. You're not seeing the same team that got swept in the playoffs by LeBron. I watched that series, and it was god-awful. But that team was also playing really bad, really isolation, really just stop the ball offense and stop the ball kind of basketball, and it was just not working. But I think with this team, at the very least, we've instilled so many good habits and so many interesting plays that we can throw at people that nobody's really prepared for, especially because I think a big advantage for us at this point is that nobody really believes in us. We could come out of nowhere, and in the playoffs, DeMar averages 32 points a game, and all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, why didn't we believe in the Raptors? And I think that this team has the potential to do that, and I don't think it's as far-fetched as people are saying.
Well, I certainly agree with you that this team is much different than it has been in past iterations. It remains to be seen, and I'm obviously going to, even as a Celtics fan, believe that the Cleveland Cavaliers are the best team in the Eastern Conference until another team wins. Levi, thanks for coming on and talking to us today, man. It was really nice to do some Raptors talk. I'm sure that we'll be doing this again as the playoffs unfold and people start to see more and more of this Toronto team, because like you said, they're much improved and they're very different. And I think a lot of people are in for an awakening when it comes to watching this team, that this is not the ball stopping, ISO heavy, low pass count team that it has been in years past. So is there anything you want to get a plug in for before we get out of here?
Well, first off, I'd like to say thanks for having me, Alex.
No problem, man.
I'd like to plug my articles on 94 Feet Report. I'd also like to plug the most recent episode of The Swingmen presented by the 94 Feet Report, which had yours truly in it, and I think I did a pretty good job, but,
Okay.
But I'd also just like to say I'm looking forward to coming back whenever we get swept by LeBron and I look like a fucking idiot.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on, and we'll definitely do it again. Regardless of how the sweeps unfold, we'll have you on again, because you really brought some insight to a team that I don't think a lot of people are watching. So thanks for coming on, man. We'll talk to you later. All right.
Yeah, man. Thank you.